Most people think Native American history begins and ends with buffalo hunters on the plains. But in the Southeast, the Choctaw were building an invisible cattle empire, herding a Spanish breed so tough it endured a 500-mile death march and shaped a frontier economy. By erasing this story, we lost a blueprint for survival and a breed whose fate was almost lost forever. How did a forgotten cow reveal a hidden past America never wanted you to see? In the spring of 1539, Hernando de Soto landed on the Gulf Coast with a cargo few would ever remember. Alongside his soldiers and horses, he brought a herd of nearly 500 cattle, long-legged, sharp-horned beasts, straight from the Iberian Peninsula. These Andalusian cattle, bred for the rugged hills and burning summers of southern Spain, were unlike anything the New World had seen. Spanish chroniclers, scribbling by firelight, recorded their arrival as a matter of logistics. Cows, bulls, oxen, all meant to feed and carry the expedition as it pressed into the unknown heart of the continent. But the land had plans of its own. The swamps of Florida and Mississippi swallowed up men and animals alike. Some cattle vanished into the cypress and palmetto, breaking through makeshift fences, scattering in storms, slipping from the hands of conquistadors too preoccupied with gold to chase after them. Over time, these escapees multiplied in the wild, far from any Spanish corral. They learned to graze on thorny brambles, to wade through shallow bayous, to watch for panthers in the underbrush. For 3 centuries, the descendants of De Soto's herd survived untended, forging a new identity in the thick forests and humid lowlands of the Southeast. Archaeological digs in old Spanish settlements have turned up bones with the unmistakable shape of Iberian cattle, narrow skulls, curved horns, smaller frames than the hulking breeds later brought from Britain. Isotopic analysis reveals a diet of marsh grasses and woody plants, proof of life in places few other cattle could endure. Chronicles such as The Gentleman of Elvas and Garcilaso de la Vega mention the herds repeatedly, noting their tendency to stray and their hardiness in the face of disease and predators. No fences held these animals for long. Over generations, natural selection favored the toughest cattle, animals that could outrun wolves, tolerate the biting insects, and survive on little more than leaves and bark. By the late 1700s, their descendants had become a fixture of the southern wilds, a living legacy of Spain's first gamble in North America. These cattle were not just survivors. They were the raw material for something remarkable, waiting for new hands to shape their future. The story of the Choctaw cow begins here, with a herd that slipped through the cracks of history, rooting itself in the mud and shadows of a continent in flux. Before treaties or trails, before railroads or ranches, the land itself was already at work, forging a breed that would outlast empires and migrations alike. In the closing years of the 18th century, a new American experiment was taking root, not in the halls of Congress, but in the fields and forests of the Southeast. President George Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox, seeking a solution to the so-called Indian problem, advanced a plan that would reshape the destiny of entire nations. Their vision, spelled out in a series of official directives and Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence, called for the civilization of native peoples through the adoption of European-style agriculture. The 1791 policy outlined the mechanics: teach the tribes to farm, to fence land, and above all, to raise livestock. The government offered subsidies for plows, seed, and breeding stock. Agents distributed cattle, swine, and even sheep, betting that the economic lure of animal husbandry would steer tribal societies away from hunting and toward a settled, market-oriented life. For the Choctaw, these incentives arrived as both a challenge and an opportunity. Their homeland, stretching across present-day Mississippi and Alabama, was already home to wild cattle descended from Spanish herds. The Washington-Knox policy did not just encourage the adoption of livestock, it made the domestication of these feral animals a pathway to political survival. Government agents, acting under the authority of the War Department, delivered livestock and implements to tribal leaders, recording each transaction in ledgers now housed in the National Archives. One such document, dated 1794, lists the disbursement of 2 cows and 1 bull to Chief Mingo Hama for the encouragement of stock raising among his people. The logic was simple. Tribes that demonstrated progress, measured in acres plowed and cattle owned, would be treated as allies, not adversaries. The Choctaw responded with remarkable speed. Within a generation, they had fenced communal pastures, organized cattle drives, and established a trade in beef and hides with American settlers and military outposts. Isaac Coleman, a federal agent stationed in the region decades later, described the scene in his reports, writing that the Indians had become the principal suppliers of beef to the posts, their herds exceeding those of the whites by a wide margin. By the turn of the 19th century, Choctaw herds numbered in the thousands, their value recorded in trade ledgers and property rolls. Livestock became both a symbol of adaptation and a bulwark against dispossession, allowing the Choctaw to participate in the cash economy while maintaining communal land tenure. The cattle themselves, descendants of those Andalusian escapees, were gradually brought under human control, gathered from the swamps and forests, branded and bred for traits that suited both the land and the needs of the people. Washington and Knox had hoped to transform native societies through agriculture. Instead, they catalyzed the rise of a cattle culture that would, for a time, make the Choctaw indispensable to the American frontier. The policies of civilization, written in the language of improvement and progress, became the scaffolding for a new kind of wealth and autonomy, one measured in hooves, hides, and the daily work of tending herds across the southern wilds. By the early 1800s, Choctaw ranchers were no longer simply gathering wild cattle, they were shaping them. In the river valleys and pine uplands of Mississippi, families worked together to create a breed that fit their world. Oral histories recall elders calling cattle home at dusk, the animals answering to familiar voices and gathering near the homestead. Missionary journals from the era describe herds of small, lively cows with coats a patchwork of reds, whites, blacks, and dappled browns, nothing like the uniform herds prized by European breeders. These were not the rangy, aggressive longhorns of Texas bred for their horns and ferocity. Choctaw cattle were selected for gentleness and utility. A cow that could be milked by hand in the morning, then turned loose to graze the woods and defend herself against wolves by night, was more valuable than one bred for show or spectacle. Community breeders, sometimes entire extended families, worked together to refine the herd. Calves that showed a calm temperament, or cows that produced rich milk and robust calves year after year, were kept and bred. Bulls that kicked or scattered at the sight of people were culled. Over time, the Choctaw developed a dual-purpose animal, equally suited for milk and meat. The cows gave enough milk to feed a household, and their meat was tender and flavorful, prized at trading posts and military outposts alike. Herd records from the period, preserved in missionary and trading ledgers, note the steady trade, beef quarters, hides, tallow, and butter, moving from Choctaw settlements to American forts and frontier towns. What set these cattle apart was not just their productivity, but their ability to thrive in a landscape that defeated other breeds. They could pick their way through thorn thickets and stand knee-deep in swamp grass, eating what other livestock would not touch. Their small, athletic frames let them outrun predators, and their instincts, honed over centuries in the wild, made them quick to spot danger. Yet unlike the wild cattle of the open range, Choctaw cows would come when called, following the voices of their keepers through the trees. Children learned to care for them, and stories passed down through generations describe cows that recognized the sound of a family's song or the clatter of a dinner pail. By 1820, the Choctaw had established a breed unlike any other in the South. Spotted, sturdy, and uncommonly gentle, these cattle were the backbone of tribal prosperity. They provided milk and meat, hides for clothing and trade, and security against hunger. Their resilience was not an accident. It was the result of decades of careful selection by people who knew the land and the animals as intimately as they knew their own kin. The Choctaw cow was not just a product of adaptation, but of intention and care, a living testament to the skill of its breeders. This quiet mastery would soon be tested in ways no one could anticipate, as the world beyond the tribal borders closed in. October 1831. With winter closing in, the first detachments of Choctaw families gathered their belongings and set out west. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek had promised safe passage, but the reality was a forced march stretching nearly 500 miles. Government wagons fell short, barely 5 for every 1,000 people. So families packed what they could onto ponies and ox carts, leaving cherished homes behind. Alongside them moved something vital: herds of cattle driven on foot by men, women, and children who knew every animal by sight. The cattle were more than property. Each cow meant milk for children, meat for the sick, and a living reserve against starvation. As the columns moved through the mud and sleet, government rations ran thin. Letters from survivors described the bitter cold and the hunger that crept in as days stretched to weeks. One elder wrote that they ate what they could carry, and it was the cows that saved them. At river crossings, the odds worsened. The Mississippi ran high that year, ferries overloaded with people and livestock. Some animals slipped and drowned, but most pressed on, their hooves cutting deep into the frozen ground. Quartermaster reports from the Bureau of Indian Affairs scattered across the National Archives note that the Choctaw drove large numbers of cattle, hogs, and ponies, a mobile food supply that government contractors could not match. One ledger from a detachment near Memphis lists over 200 cattle herded for milk and beef, supplementing the meager government beef contracts along the route. The march claimed lives at a staggering rate. By the time the last detachments reached Indian Territory, more than 15% of the people who had started the journey were gone, lost to cold, disease, and exhaustion. Mortality logs and agent journals tally over 2,000 deaths, though the true number may never be known. Yet, the cattle endured. Agent summaries call their losses negligible compared to the human toll. Unlike the British breeds that would later collapse on these same trails, the Choctaw cattle foraged on prairie grass and brambles, surviving where draft animals failed. On days when the rations ran out, the herds became lifelines. Families slaughtered cattle as needed, sharing meat with those too weak to walk. Children drank milk from cows that had survived the swamps and forests of Mississippi, now trudging through the bitter Oklahoma wind. Survivor letters recall the sound of hooves at night, a comfort in the dark, proof that something from home had made it through. No one kept a perfect count. Some agent reports estimate thousands of cattle made the crossing, but the records are scattered and incomplete. What is certain, the Choctaw cattle walked the Trail of Tears alongside their people, enduring the same hardships and, in many cases, outlasting them. The herds that survived would become the foundation for rebuilding in a strange new land, carrying the memory of those lost along the way. Indian Territory in the mid-1800s was a world shaped by open range and collective ambition. After the long march west, the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations found themselves on millions of acres of new ground, land held not by individuals, but by the tribe as a whole. This communal ownership was more than a legal detail. It was the backbone of a cattle economy, unlike any other in North America. With no fences to divide the prairie, herds could roam for miles, grazing on native grasses and sheltering in wooded draws. Tribal governments set the rules, managing grazing rights and organizing roundups that brought together entire communities. The land itself became a living commons, and the cattle, descendants of those that had survived the Trail of Tears, multiplied in the open country. By the 1840s, these communal pastures were supporting herds that rivaled anything seen in Texas. Official maps from the era show tribal land stretching across what would become southeastern Oklahoma, marked by cattle trails and gathering points. Revenue records from the Chickasaw and Choctaw governments document a thriving trade in beef, hides, and tallow moving north to Kansas railheads and east to Arkansas markets. Tribal councils levied grazing fees and tolls on the famous Chisholm Trail, collecting payments from non-native cattlemen who drove their herds through Indian Territory on the way to the stockyards of Abilene and Dodge City. These tolls became a major source of income, funding schools, roads, and public works, evidence of a sophisticated economy built on collective land and shared resources. The scale of these operations was staggering. Before the Civil War, the 5 tribes controlled an estimated 250,000 head of cattle. The Cherokee Strip Livestock Association, founded in 1883, was called the greatest livestock organization in the world by contemporary observers. But the communal systems of the Choctaw and Chickasaw were just as ambitious. Herds moved freely across open range, managed by cowboys drawn from tribal families and freedmen. Branding irons, not barbed wire, defined ownership, and disputes were settled in tribal courts. The land's bounty was shared, and so was the risk. Drought, prairie fire, or stampede could threaten everyone, but the rewards were equally communal. This era brought prosperity and a sense of security. Communal grazing allowed families without large private holdings to participate in the cattle boom, and the tribal governments ensured that wealth did not concentrate in a few hands. The system fostered cooperation, innovation, and resilience. For nearly half a century, the open-range economy of Indian Territory stood as proof that collective stewardship could produce abundance on a continental scale. But this golden age was always under threat, as outside interests eyed the land and the wealth it generated. The very structure that made the Choctaw cattle economy so strong would soon become a target for federal policy, setting the stage for a new struggle over land, herds, and the future of the people. Cattle ranching in Indian Territory faced a threat that wiped out fortunes across the American South. Texas tick fever was the disease that did it, spread by tiny brown ticks that struck imported British breeds with deadly speed. Veterinary records from the late 1800s and the early 1900s tell the story in stark numbers. In Oklahoma, as open ranges, Hereford and Angus herds, brought in by settlers hoping to modernize the beef trade, suffered mortality rates as high as 90% in their first year on tick-infested pastures. Calves died in droves, and even mature cows lasted only a season or two before succumbing to fever. tick fever. But the Choctaw cattle, shaped by centuries in the humid southeast, stood apart. Oklahoma State University Early Extension Bulletins and the USDA Bureau of Animal Industry reports showed that these native herds lost fewer than 5% of their number to the same disease. Some years, losses were so low they barely registered in ranchers' ledgers. Oklahoma State University parasitologists later confirmed the pattern. Choctaw cattle, descended from the Iberian stock that survived the swamps of Mississippi, carried natural immunity. Their blood showed low levels of Babesia parasites, but no sign of the fever that killed imported breeds. Tick-resistant. This difference was not just a quirk of biology, it was the foundation of tribal prosperity. Communal grazing lands teemed with hardy tick-resistant cattle while neighboring ranchers watched their investments wither. Extension agents recorded that, by 1900, native stock made up the overwhelming majority of viable herds in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations. The cattle not only survived, they thrived, producing milk, meat, and calves year after year, where others failed. Foundation. The numbers left little room for doubt. In controlled studies, Hereford and Angus calves exposed to tick-infested grass died at rates above 80%, while Choctaw calves grazed the same ground and lived. USDA veterinarians, reviewing mortality charts from hundreds of herds, called these cattle indispensable for ranching in tick zones. Their resilience allowed tribal economies to flourish, even as the fever reshaped the fate of the southern cattle industry. Indispensable. This biological advantage, forged in the heat and hardship of the swamps, gave the Choctaw cattle a dominance that no imported breed could match. It was a quiet shield, invisible to the eye, but undeniable in the survival of herds and the wealth they sustained. The story of tick immunity is not just a footnote, it is a key to understanding why these cattle and the people who raised them held their ground for so long against the odds. Resilience. Survey. Crews arrived with iron chains and wooden stakes, driving them into the prairie grass where cattle once roamed free. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, the federal government sent agents to divide tribal lands into neat squares, each marked on freshly printed maps from the National Archives. Where once there had been millions of acres of open range, now there were grid lines, every family assigned a 160-acre parcel, every pasture fenced, every deed recorded in the ledgers of the Dawes Commission. Land that had been held in common for generations was measured, cataloged, and parceled out, often by strangers who knew nothing of the old grazing routes or the bonds between families and herds. For the Choctaw and Chickasaw, this was more than a bureaucratic exercise. The communal system that had supported their cattle economy collapsed almost overnight. Cattle that once drifted from creek bottoms to upland meadows now found themselves penned in by barbed wire. The herds, scattered across dozens of small plots, lost the ability to graze freely. Families who had relied on the collective strength of shared land now faced the reality of isolated, shrinking pastures. Without the open range, many could no longer support their animals through the dry months or harsh winters. Land agents, armed with survey maps and legal authority, pressured families to sign away deeds, sometimes for a fraction of their value. Economic desperation set in as cattle numbers fell and markets faltered. The communal bonds that had allowed the Choctaw cattle to flourish were broken, replaced by a system that favored outside buyers and speculators. The old world of open range and shared abundance gave way to a patchwork of private plots, each one a reminder of what had been lost. Early in the 20th century, A new language crept into the cattle business of Oklahoma and the South. Government bulletins and county agents began to call native breeds, small, spotted, and tough, by a single word: scrub. The term appeared in USDA pamphlets and extension circulars sent to every rural mailbox, warning that these cattle were a drag on progress. Charts compared the size of Choctaw cows to imported Herefords and Angus, with arrows pointing to the supposed advantages of bigger frames and uniform color. Agents arrived at tribal farms with glossy posters and government-subsidized bulls, promising that crossbreeding would bring prosperity and respect. The message was clear. The cattle that had survived swamps, ticks, and the Trail of Tears were now seen as backward, a symbol of poverty rather than resilience. USDA bulletins from 1907 and 1912 echoed the same refrain: scrubbed cattle must be improved or removed. County fairs gave blue ribbons to the largest, reddest imported bulls, while spotted native cows were dismissed as relics of a less civilized time. Extension agents, sometimes themselves recent arrivals from the Midwest, urged native families to trade their herds for the offspring of Hereford sires, offering government loans and even free breeding services to speed the transition. This campaign of persuasion was relentless. Improvement became the watchword, and the pressure to conform was as much social as it was economic. By the 1920s, the effects were visible in the pastures. Native cattle numbers plummeted, and the genetic legacy of the Choctaw herds was diluted with every new crossbred calf. What had once been a source of tribal wealth and survival was recast as an obstacle to progress, swept aside by the march of modern agriculture. By the 1920s, a new threat stalked the last pure Choctaw cattle. Oklahoma law required every head of cattle to be driven through a concrete vat filled with arsenic solution twice a year to combat the relentless spread of Texas tick fever. On paper, the rule was simple: dip or be destroyed. In practice, the mandate handed county sheriffs and state inspectors sweeping power over every pasture and backwoods hollow where native herds might hide. Official bulletins spelled out the consequences for non-compliance. Any animal that could not be rounded up and run through the vat was branded a public nuisance. Local lawmen, sometimes accompanied by federal tick inspectors, arrived with rifles and the authority of state statutes behind them. For families who still managed bands of Choctaw cattle, small, quick-footed, and wary of corrals, the new regime was a disaster. Reports from enforcement logs detail roundups in Pushmataha and McCurtain counties, where deputies shot cattle that refused to be driven or that bolted into the timber at the scent of chemicals. The law offered no exemptions for heritage or history. It treated all resistant animals as vectors of disease, regardless of their legacy or immunity. The impact was immediate and severe. Herd numbers plummeted as sheriffs enforced the dipping rule with lethal efficiency, especially in the rough country where Choctaw cattle had always thrived. Families who tried to resist or hide their animals faced fines, threats, and the loss of bloodlines that had survived every previous assault. The arsenic vats did more than kill ticks. They provided the perfect legal excuse to erase the last remnants of a breed that had already survived so much. In the thick timber of southeastern Oklahoma, a handful of Choctaw families refused to let the old bloodline vanish. The Whiteman and Carter families, living miles from the nearest road, kept their herds out of sight, sometimes driving cattle deep into the woods at the first rumor of government men or county agents. Oral histories recall how children learned to whistle a secret tune that brought the cows in at dusk, and elders told stories of calves born in the shadows, never seen by outsiders. These families risked fines and threats, but their stubbornness became a quiet act of defiance. For decades, their cattle grazed among blackjack oaks and river cane, hidden from the world that had labeled them worthless. In these remote pockets, the Choctaw cow survived not by accident, but by the deliberate care of people who saw them as kin, not just livestock. By the middle of the 20th century, the cattle industry in America was shifting its priorities. Feedlots replaced open pastures, and meat packers demanded animals of uniform size and color for boxed beef shipments. The small, athletic Choctaw cow, once prized for surviving on brambles and heat, no longer fit the commercial blueprint. Packing houses paid by the pound, and buyers favored massive English breeds that could be fattened quickly in crowded pens. Market reports from the 1970s show premiums for Hereford and Angus steers, while native cattle fetched only salvage prices, if they sold at all. By 1980, agricultural directories and breed registries stopped listing the Choctaw cow altogether. Industry experts declared it extinct, erasing the breed from both the marketplace and the official record. The story of the Choctaw cow faded, lost beneath the relentless drive for standardization and profit. In the early 2000s, a handful of cattle from hidden herds made their way into university labs for genetic testing. Scientists expected a jumble of mixed ancestry, but the results told a different story. DNA analysis revealed distinct Iberian markers, signatures found only in the oldest Spanish breeds brought by De Soto nearly 5 centuries earlier. These Choctaw cattle carried rare haplotypes for heat tolerance and disease resistance, markers that had vanished from modern commercial herds. Fewer than 400 animals showed this unique genetic fingerprint, making them one of the last living reservoirs of Spanish colonial bloodlines in North America. Dr. Phil Sponenberg, a conservation geneticist, confirmed that these were not just relics. They were a scientific treasure, proof that the Choctaw cow was a breed apart, shaped by centuries of survival and human care. On the rolling hills outside Tuskahoma, the Choctaw Nation has reclaimed a piece of its living heritage. Tribal leaders secured hundreds of acres specifically for these cattle, not for feedlots or mass production, but for a new kind of stewardship. The grazing program is run by land managers who see these animals as more than relics. Each season, herds of Choctaw cattle move across native prairie, browsing on tough grasses and brush just as their ancestors did centuries ago. The land itself benefits. Their hooves break up the soil, their grazing controls invasive weeds, and their presence restores balance to the ecosystem. Instead of chasing industrial beef markets, the nation uses these herds for conservation grazing and cultural education, teaching younger generations about resilience, adaptation, and the deep ties between people, animals, and land. What was nearly lost has become a symbol of ongoing care and belonging. Today, only a few hundred Choctaw cattle remain, genetically unique, living proof of resilience that outlasted erasure. As climate change threatens global food security, scientists now study these cattle for traits lost to industrial breeds, including heat tolerance, disease resistance, and adaptability. Their survival is not just heritage, it is a lesson in what we risk when we erase indigenous knowledge. The land remembers, even when history forgets. Share your thoughts below and join the conversation.